All right, so getting into the third part of the Chapter 25 overview, we're going to start with social structures and then move into economics. In the top picture here, you can see a Latin American Spanish family, and you can see a mestizo, also an indigenous mother, and a European father. This is the indigenous mother, European father, and mestizo child. Whereas in North America, clearly no mixing, right? This is an English family here. Okay, so like as I said, as promised, you've got the different classes. Peninsulare, aka people directly from Spain or Portugal, on the top of the class system. Below them are their descendants, the Creoles. Then you've got the mixture of the mestizo, the indigenous European. Mulattoes would be the African European. Below them would be the Zambos, which would be a mixture of indigenous and African. And then on the bottom, the native Indians and the black slaves. Moving into economics. When you look at Spanish colonies, silver was the most prosperous for the Spanish. And their silver mines were mainly in Zacatecas, in Mexico, and then in Latin America, or excuse me, in what was the Inca territory, Potosi. When we get back to mercantilism, it's kind of interesting because, like I said in class, 1/5 of all of the silver produced went directly to the Spanish crown. Again, they wanted to have a stockpile of this silver to show their wealth. Silver from the Americas ensured a powerful Spanish army and navy, and eventually made its way into the world market. Agriculture and craft production were also important to the inhabitants of New Spain, and the hacienda was the center for both of these activities. People made wool, musical instruments, all kinds of different stuff. Silverware. In an attempt to supply laborers for mines and farms, um, but also provide fair wages and reduce brutal treatment. Like I said, the encomiendas were replaced by the repartimientos, and we already went over those, so I'm not going to go into them in great detail. And like I said, this still resulted in low productivity because people were using slow work in order to rebel. In Brazil, the social and economic center of the society was sugar. These sugar plantations were called engejo. This was an incredibly brutal form of labor. Labor, because of the lack of experienced cultivators and the ravages of disease, remained a problem throughout this time. Um, in the end, the Portuguese turned to a particularly horrific form of slavery, and these slaves were brought in from, of course, Africa. More slaves died every year than were born in Spanish, or excuse me, in Portuguese Brazil. By 1700, there was 150,000 slaves in Brazil. This is, oops, excuse me. This was half the population. About 70% of all slaves shipped to the Americas went to the sugar islands and Brazil. And we'll read a report from The Economist about these this incredible system eventually in class. Moving back to Spain, there's one thing I wanted to mention to you. Remember that 1/3 to 1/2 of all of the silver went directly to China. The Spanish peso was actually legal currency in China. So here you can see, this is the reason I wanted to bring that up, the Manila galleon route and the lands of Oceania. You can see the Dutch possessions here. They used an incredibly brutal form of slavery to produce a lot of rubber in these plantations. And then the Spanish possessions also moving towards China, Macau, and Japan. Here's the hacienda in Chile. And here are slaves working in a Brazilian sugar mill. Sugar mills were used to produce molasses, but also they were used to produce alcohol, which was one of the most valuable crops besides, or along with molasses, that the sugar mills were producing. And this is the boiling of the sugar. You can only imagine in the hot climate boiling this plant. It's truly horrific to think about the brutality that went into this labor and the millions of lives. North America had a quite different economic system. Different social, political, and economic factors ensured that trade, first in fur, like beaver pelts, which almost led to their extinction, but these are mainly used for hats. And then from tobacco, these were of central importance. Indentured servants and eventually slaves provided labor forces for these different adventures, and including things also like indigo, cotton, which you might remember from U.S. history. Although the southern colonies may have owned the slaves, the northern colonies also benefited from their labor. So in the south, they had the plantations, but in the north, the goods were used in different, first labor centers, and then eventually factories. Think about why it might be better to have indentured servants than to have, from these landowners' perspective, to have slaves rather than indentured servants. Think about some of the reasons that they might have switched to that type of labor. Last but not least, we mentioned Oceania. The peoples of Oceania discovered that their greater isolation provided a few centuries respite, but not total protection from the Europeans. For almost 1,500 years, Europeans had theorized about the existence of Terra Australis Incognita, or the unknown southern land. The first recorded sightings of Australia, originally known as New Holland, were made by Dutch sailors in 1606. So a little bit away from what we're learning about now, but it's included because it's the initial contact in this chapter. Although the Portuguese probably did arrive there first. Captain James Cook finally charted the entire continent in 1770. And initially the reports were not favorable. It wasn't until 1788 that the English decided to make use of Australia as a penal colony, meaning like a big, huge open jail. And they put mainly people like debtors, small criminals, nonviolent criminals in this area. Areas such as Guam and the Marianas fell under Spanish control in the 1670s and 1780s. Islands like Tahiti and Hawaii were increasingly brought into the European trading network too. Unfortunately, Europeans in Oceania brought diseases with them and staggering loss of life. So it's the same sad story that you see in these other regions. Eventually, in the end, Portugal and Spain lost their colonies and lost some of the profit because of these colonies, from these colonies, excuse me, because they focused on profit and not infrastructure, and on resource extraction rather than creation. And that is the end of the chapter 25 overview. Thank you for listening. Remember to do um, the listening check questions.